Hi, Ken Brusso here. If you've heard any of my other recordings, you may have heard me say that the reason my colleagues and I focus so much on decision making is because decision making is at the very center of almost everything we do. And that's true for us as individual decision makers and also for teams as decision makers. And that's the focus of this particular recording today, team decision making. Decision making is not a single activity. There are a number of different activities that are involved in decision making. And ideally, those activities follow a logical sequence. For us as individual decision makers, we sometimes can get the cart before the horse, so to speak, get out of step with what that logical sequence would be. For teams, however, getting out of phase with the activities of decision making is a much more complex and difficult issue. One of the main reasons why it's more complex to keep teams properly aligned with the phases of decision making is that teams are almost always composed of people whose styles and modes of thinking and decision making differ. To follow a logical sequence of phases of decision making requires that the team members get on the same page with each other, so to speak, at the same time. A common example of a style-related issue occurs when one person is ready to close in on a particular solution when another is still exploring the decision and wants even more information before being ready to pull the trigger and make a decision. Consequently, when teams get out of phase like this, the result is often confusion, tensions, sometimes outright conflict and chaos. None of this is good for team decision making, of course. In our experience, the key to managing a good team decision making process is to keep the team focused on the same phase of decision making at the same time. For team leaders, this requires a good understanding of the phases of decision making and of the styles and thinking propensities of the team members. Let's first of all turn to what those activities are. There are different ways to cut up the decision-making process, and different people often do that, but generally speaking, they all fall into 5 basic categories that I'm showing here on this slide. Number 1, defining the decision that's to be made. What's its purpose? What are some of the parameters around the decision? 2, gathering facts and information. Analyzing that information. 4, identifying potential alternative courses of actions or strategies. And 5, selecting a final decision, solution, or strategy for the decision at hand. Okay, I'm going to go through each of these one at a time to make sure that it's clear what the unique features are about each of the phases of decision making. And I'll make comments as I go about the kinds of styles that are most comfortable with each of the phases and the ones that aren't going to be so comfortable. This will be important for the team leader or whoever is facilitating the team decision-making situation so that they can encourage people to take a deep breath, step back, or come forward because the particular phase suits their particular mode of thinking or style well. So let's start with the first most basic phase, and this is the easiest one to kind of leap right over or forget all about. Define the decision that needs to be made. What is the purpose? Don't assume that everyone's on the same page and everyone sees the purpose and the objective of this decision in exactly the same way. So get that out, bring it out on the table. What's the main purpose? What is the main reason why a decision is needed? What are the results that are needed? What's the importance of this decision? Is it critical, or is it just a decision is needed and we can move on? Has this decision ever been addressed before? If so, what are the results? You can do this pretty quickly. It's important, though, to do it explicitly and don't just leap over it and make an assumption that everyone understands the decision in the same way. The next phase is gathering the facts and information. Now, this is going to test some people's patience. They're not going to have the same degree of patience for going out and getting a lot of facts or even sitting in a meeting and listening to information being presented. Some people will want to get on to making the actual decision relatively quickly. So this is a time for the more action-oriented people to step back a little bit, or at least to tolerate the information gathering portion. And one of the ways to help them tolerate it is to make sure, if you're the facilitator or the leader, make sure that they understand that we will get to a point where we'll make a decision. This is not going to go on forever. We're going to do it in this particular phase of the decision-making process, and then we will move on. So what information is needed? What are the sources of information? What are the people and the places that need to be plumbed for information? Is that information going to be available immediately, or is it going to have to be unearthed and dug up from various sources? Only after the information that's needed is identified and it's been gathered can we then move on from this phase. The next phase is analyzing the information that has been gathered. What does the information say? Is it like pieces of a puzzle that you can put together and build a complete picture of the decision situation? Are there important unknowns that remain after gathering the information? Do we have to then go out and gather more information, or are we going to have to tolerate the uncertainty and play with different scenarios? At the end of this particular phase, it's important to summarize the information. What has the information told us? What are the key findings? The next phase, number 4, is identifying solutions and alternate possibilities, alternate actions or strategies that might be needed for the decision. And again, this will press people who are more action-oriented, who may want to zero in on a particular course of action quickly, when there are other options that are maybe less obvious that might even serve the situation better. So this is where the analytic thinkers, particularly the ones with more agile way of thinking, can see the pros and cons and different sides of any issue. These are the people who will need to come to the fore and play a more active role in identifying possible courses of action. If this is a real novel situation that hasn't been addressed before, will we need to come up with some very unique possibilities? If so, then a brainstorming session might be needed to quickly generate ideas and other possibilities without going into each one of them in a lot of detail, just quickly getting the ideas out on the table, and then they can be looked at more analytically. Once alternate possibilities have been identified, the process needs to look at what the pros and cons of the different courses of action are. In other words, they need to be weighed in terms of their relative merits. And in this process, attention needs to be given to practical considerations. You may come up with a very novel solution, but it may be very difficult to implement that course of action. There may be roadblocks. This is where, in fact, the more action-oriented people can be relied upon in the process. The ones who are going to say, wait a minute, this isn't going to work well. I can see obstacles. They need to be encouraged to speak up at this part of the process. And finally, the 5th phase is actually selecting a course of action, or maybe it might be multiple courses of action. What are we actually going to do? This is where the people who are eager to jump to the conclusion at the beginning will be able to play a more active role. What are we actually going to do first, second, and third? Who needs to be informed? How are we going to review and track progress and evaluate outcomes? So these are the 5 most important phases of decision making. In managing this process, it's going to be very important to be very clear when we're ending one phase and moving into another one, to make those boundaries very clear and distinct as much as practical.